Joe Carter had spent most of his 58 years in the same Detroit neighborhood, hidden behind a corrugated tin door painted with a crooked sign that read, Rusty Joe's Garage. The place smelled of old oil, warm engines, and memories too heavy to air out. His hands, rough with age and decades of grease, still remembered how to hold a wrench tighter than regret. The garage was his world, an island of half-fixed cars and unpaid invoices where dreams rarely stopped by. He never expected a billionaire or a broken child to find him there. It was an unusually cold Tuesday morning. When Joe heard the squeak of the garage door and looked up from under the hood of a battered Chevy, his eyes met a pair of polished black heels, wholly out of place among oil stains and rusted bolts. Victoria Langley stood there, perfectly pressed coat draped over her shoulders, hair pinned into an immaculate bun that money and status demanded. Beside her was a little girl in a wheelchair, small frame bundled in a puffy pink jacket, eyes wide with curiosity, a spark that no diagnosis could snuff out. Joe wiped his hands on a rag, stepping forward with a caution that life had hammered into him over years of loss. Victoria didn't bother with polite small talk. She came straight to the point, her voice low, hesitant in this grimy temple of grease and gears. Lily, her daughter, had tried the world's best braces, the world's best surgeons. Money had opened every door, but hope had slipped through every crack. Someone had whispered a name to her in passing, an old mechanic who once built something miraculous for his own boy. Joe didn't flinch at the memory. He simply lowered himself to Lily's level, squatting. Until his old knees popped in protest, he asked her name. She told him with a shy smile that revealed a missing front tooth. He asked her what her favorite color was. She whispered yellow. Joe felt his heart twist, remembering his Tommy, his boy who once wore yellow sneakers because they made him feel fast even when his legs wouldn't obey. The shop was silent, except for the distant hum of a radio. Victoria opened a leather folder and spread out medical reports on Joe's cluttered workbench. He didn't bother reading them. Instead, he touched Lily's braced legs, gently, respectfully. The braces were shiny, high-tech, heavy. Too heavy for the tiny bones they were meant to lift. Joe asked Lily if she could wiggle her toes. She tried. She grinned at him when she failed. That grin lit up a corner of his mind that had been locked away for years, where hope still waited under a tarp of grief and old receipts. Victoria pulled out her checkbook, pen poised over the top corner, ready to pay. Away her desperation. Joe raised a hand. He didn't want money. He asked her to come back tomorrow, same time. No suits, no questions. Just Lily, her smile, and whatever courage they both could carry. That night, after locking up, Joe rummaged through dusty drawers, tugging out a bent cardboard box, taped shut and stained by time. Inside were Tommy's old braces, the sketches they'd scribbled on the backs of junk mail, dreams welded from scrap. He laid the parts out on his workbench, cleared aside carburetors and spark plugs to make room for pieces of a miracle. Joe hadn't built anything for a child since Tommy's accident. After the funeral, the braces went into the box, and the shop turned quiet in ways that only a parent's grief understands. But tonight he wiped the rust off hope. He measured the old braces against Lily's photograph that Victoria had left behind, running his finger over the scribbles that once mapped his boy's legs. Morning broke cold and grey, but inside Rusty Joe's garage it felt warmer than it had in years. Victoria pushed Lily through the door just as Joe flipped the sign to open. They found him already at work, welding thin aluminum rods, lightweight, but strong enough to carry small bones. Joe talked to Lily like she was an equal, explaining each tool, showing her how the braces would bend but not break. Victoria sat on an overturned oil drum pinching, her phone between her palms, but never looking at it. Each day bled into the next, the shop transforming around them. Joe's neighbors dropped by with thermoses of coffee. Curious kids peeked through the cracked garage windows, and Lily's giggle bounced off the steel beams above. Joe measured Her legs again and again, trimming straps, sanding edges smooth so they wouldn't bruise her skin. He painted the braces yellow, the same bright, brave shade his Tommy once wore on his shoes. When Lily asked why, Joe told her yellow was what hope looked like when you couldn't see the sun. Victoria, always guarded in her power suits and cold confidence, started rolling up her sleeves too. She fetched bolts, held, measuring tape steady when Joe's hands trembled, and brewed bitter coffee in a stained kettle no billionaire's kitchen would dare hold. She watched Lily practice tiny pushes with her feet, watched her daughter's eyes light up every time Joe tightened a strap or adjusted an angle. In between fittings, Victoria found herself asking Joe about Tommy, questions she knew might open wounds, but Joe answered anyway, his voice quiet but steady. One night after Lily had fallen asleep on a folded blanket in the corner, Joe told Victoria about the accident, how a drunk driver stole more than just his boy. He told her about the guilt that clung like oil under fingernails, how he spent years trying to fix engines because he couldn't fix the thing that mattered. Victoria listened, her eyes soft in the low hum of a single workbench lamp. When Joe finished, she didn't say sorry. She just squeezed his shoulder, a mother understanding a father's ache. They worked through the week, fine-tuning the braces until they felt like wings instead of weights. On the 7th day, Joe asked Lily if she was ready to stand. Her little fingers trembled as she gripped his callous hands, braces locked around her thin legs, shoes polished and laced tight. Victoria stood behind her, breath caught halfway between a prayer and a sob. Joe counted down from 3. Lily pushed, left foot, first then right, wobbly, slow but real enough to make the cracked concrete floor feel like a ballroom stage. Victoria sank to her knees right there on the oil-stained floor, hands over her mouth, her tears slipping past her perfect makeup. Lily laughed, the sound echoing through the shop, bouncing off tools and old mufflers like an anthem for every parent who had ever begged for one more miracle. Joe didn't weep, he just held Lily's tiny shoulders, steadying her steps as the world around them held its breath. The sign outside still read, Rusty Joe's garage, but inside something new was being built, something money alone could never buy. Neighbors poured in when they heard the news. Someone brought cookies, someone else brought balloons. Joe found himself lifting Lily high onto his shoulders, the same way he once carried Tommy after his first steps. Victoria didn't care who watched her cry anymore. She clutched Joe's grease-streaked hand, like it was the only thing anchoring her to this new, brighter world. That night, under flickering shop lights and the distant hum of Detroit streets, a billionaire mother, a poor mechanic, and a little girl in yellow braces stitched together a hope strong enough to carry them all. 2 days after Lily's first brave steps, Rusty Joe's garage looked nothing like the forgotten shop it had been. The concrete floor was swept clean, and the corners where old carburetors, once rusted, now held stacks of colorful boxes, new parts, donated tools, gifts from neighbors who couldn't build braces but knew how to bring coffee, cookies, and fresh hope. Victoria stayed too. She didn't return to her glass office towers or boardroom meetings. She wanted to see what came next, for Lily, for herself, for the man who built miracles from scrap. Every morning, Victoria watched Lily practice tiny steps between painted lines. Joe marked on the floor with yellow tape. They laughed when she wobbled, clapped when she managed 4 steps instead of 3. Joe adjusted screws and straps, each tweak lighter and smoother than the last. He scribbled notes on the back of old invoices, measuring Lily's growing confidence in numbers only he could translate into steel and leather. Sometimes he'd lean on his workbench, lost in thought, a small smile hidden under his mustache when Lily called him Grandpa Joe. Victoria started showing up in old jeans and sneakers instead of tailored suits. She swept the garage floor without being asked. She brewed coffee in the rusty kettle and didn't flinch when it tasted more like motor oil than caffeine. She and Joe sat on stacked tires during lunch breaks, watching Lily on a folded blanket, her yellow braces resting beside her like trophies she'd won from fate. They didn't talk much, but they didn't need to. Their silence stitched two broken lives together in quiet understanding. One evening, as the last light of day painted the oil stains gold, Joe pulled out an old cardboard box he hadn't touched in years. Inside, beneath yellowed newspapers and a faded Polaroid of Tommy, was a blueprint marked Freedom Cart. It was the design for a lightweight walker he and Tommy once dreamed of building. He showed it to Victoria. She ran her fingers over the lines, imagining Lily's tiny hands gripping the handles, her steps steadied by wheels and hope. Joe didn't promise a miracle, just another chance to fight for one. They worked late that night. Joe rummaged through drawers, pulling out spare parts from half-dismantled lawnmowers and busted bikes. Victoria, hair tied up, held flashlights steady, fetched wrenches and scribbled notes when Joe's hands were too busy welding metal joints together. The sparks danced in the shadows like fireflies, lighting up Lily's sleeping face every time the torch hissed. By midnight, the first frame was done, rough, imperfect, but ready for tomorrow's trial run. Joe wiped sweat and tears from his eyes with the same sleeve. At dawn, Lily woke to find the walker waiting for her. Joe explained how it would hold her weight, how she could push it forward instead of leaning on her braces alone. Victoria held her breath as Lily stood between the handles. The first step was shaky, but the wheels rolled smooth and steady across the concrete. Joe held the back to guide her, and Victoria trailed alongside, whispering praise and promises she'd once been too afraid to speak aloud. One step turned into 10. 10 steps turned into the promise of a hallway race. News of Lily's steps spread past the block. Soon, cars lined the curb outside Rusty, Joe's garage. Some brought donations. Boxes of soft padding, adjustable wheels, spare metals. Others brought questions. Parents from neighborhoods near and far, some wealthy, some broke like Joe used to be, asked him if he could help their kids. Joe, overwhelmed by the chorus of need, stood beside Victoria and Lily, eyes darting from faces to outstretched hands. He knew he was just an old mechanic, but he also knew what it meant to have nowhere else to go. Victoria stepped forward first. She told the waiting parents that Rusty Joe's garage wasn't a charity or a business anymore. It was something better. It was a chance for hope, built with old hands and honest hearts. She offered to pay for new tools, more parts, even a proper sign that didn't lean to the side. Joe grumbled at first, but when he saw Lily's grin reflected in the polished brace, he nodded. They were in this together now, a billionaire, a mechanic, a child whose steps echoed like thunder. Days turned to weeks. Joe's old sign came replaced with one that read Tommy's Walkers and Braces, hope built here. Victoria handled the calls, emails, donations. Joe did the work, welding, sanding, adjusting straps with the same patience he once used, fixing engines that coughed and rattled until they roared to life. Lily became the shop's mascot, rolling between workbenches on her yellow braces, handing Joe bolts and laughing when he misplaced his glasses for the 100th time. On Sundays, Joe took Lily to the old park, where he once pushed Tommy's wheelchair. Now he watched Lily push her walker on the cracked path, chasing after squirrels and dandelion seeds. Victoria sat on a nearby bench, tears drying before they could fall, her laughter rising like bells above the hum of the city. Joe found himself smiling more often, each grin a tribute to the boy he lost and the girl he'd found. Some wounds don't heal, they just learn to hold miracles alongside the pain. One evening, when the garage was quiet except for the echo of Lily's giggles, Victoria handed Joe an envelope. Inside was a deed. The garage, the lot, the land. It sat on, now his forever. Joe shook his head, mumbling about not needing charity. But Victoria pressed his hand and said it wasn't charity, it was gratitude. Gratitude for giving her daughter what no doctor, no surgeon, no pile of money could. Joe didn't argue. He simply tucked the envelope into his workbench drawer, right beside Tommy's old Polaroid. Months passed. The shop buzzed every day, filled with kids trying on braces, Parents learning how to adjust straps, neighbors dropping off sandwiches, and the pies. Joe trained 2 young apprentices, kids who knew how to fix bikes, but now learned how to fix hope. Victoria turned the garage office into a small waiting room with second-hand chairs and bright yellow walls. She framed Lily's first steps photo and hung it above Joe's workbench so every child and parent who came through the door knew what was possible when people refused to give up. One rainy Thursday, a black limousine pulled up outside the garage. The driver knocked on Joe's door, umbrella raised. Over a man in a crisp suit. He was an investor, someone who heard about Tommy's walkers and braces and wanted to franchise the idea, spread it to other cities, other families. Joe listened politely, hands folded, eyes drifting to where Lily played hopscotch in the hallway with her new braces. He thanked the man for his offer and declined. Some things couldn't be franchised. Some miracles had to be built by hand, one child at a time. The limousine drove away, leaving wet tire tracks on the cracked asphalt. Joe went back inside, wiping rain from his cheeks. And though Victoria knew some of it wasn't rain at all, she poured him a cup of too strong coffee. They watched Lily balance on one foot, arms spread wide, giggling as she toppled onto a pile of old rags. Joe laughed so hard his chest ached, a good ache, the kind that reminded him he was still alive, still needed. Sometimes fixing people was easier than fixing cars. Sometimes it was the same thing. On a warm spring afternoon, Victoria stood by the garage door, phone pressed to her ear. It was a call from a father, 2 states away, his son born too soon, legs too weak. Could they help? Victoria turned to Joe, eyebrows raised in question. Joe just shrugged, picked up a measuring tape, and nodded. Tell him to bring the boy, he said, voice rough with years, but steady as the day he first picked up a wrench. We'll see what these old hands can still build. Outside, Lily raced down the sidewalk in her yellow braces, chasing butterflies with tiny feet that once couldn't take a single step. Victoria watched her daughter disappear into the sunlight, then looked at Joe, her eyes shining with the tears of a billionaire mother who finally knew what hope tasted like. Rusty Joe's garage wasn't rusted anymore. It was alive, a patch of ground where dreams rolled. Forward on tiny wheels and old hands built tomorrow from scraps no one else saw. And that was worth more than any fortune in the world.